The first thing he feels isn't fear, it's the vibration. A deep, bone-buzzing tremor rolling through the aluminum skin of the B-17, shaking the twin, 50 seconds beneath his gloves, as if the airplane itself is warning him. 25,000 feet above Germany, the air is so thin it bites through layers of wool like broken glass. Frost blooms across the plexiglass around his face. His breath hangs in the space between life and death. I can still hear it, the hollow clatter of the tail section, the rattling oxygen mask, the metallic taste of panic. For one suspended heartbeat, the sky feels silent, too silent. Then, movement. A dark shape cuts upward through the haze, sleek, predatory, precise. A Fokker-Wulf 190 angling into the blind spot every gunner fears. 6 o'clock low. The kill cone. Through the cockpit glass of the German fighter, the pilot sees nothing but opportunity. The American bomber is lumbering forward, wounded slower than it should be. The tail gunner is already behind the curve. The pilot can read it in the hesitant sway of the guns, the delayed tracking, the micro-wobble of uncertainty. He presses his lips together, steadying the throttle. 5 seconds. Back in the tail, the gunner forces his numb fingers around the spade grips. The cold burns, the recoil pads vibrate, the headset crackles with distant voices he no longer hears. He tries to center the ring and bead sight, but the target is moving too fast, too low, slicing upward in an angle no iron sight was ever designed to solve. 4 seconds. Wind shear screams around the tail. The bomber tilts. The world narrows into a tunnel of grey sky, black smoke, and one incoming streak of death. 3 seconds. The fighter's cannons warm, a double flash of orange, a heartbeat of silence before destruction. 2 seconds. The gunner blinks, sweat or maybe ice out of his eyes. The reticle floats just behind the target. He knows he's late. He knows he's off. He knows that if he fires now, his tracers will arc harmlessly into the empty sky. 1 second. He pulls the trigger anyway. And in this frozen sliver of time, in this impossible angle, in this suicidal geometry of speed, altitude, and hopeless math, lies a truth no one in the 8th Air Force has realized yet. A two-year-old factory worker is about to invent something illegal, improvised, and mechanically absurd that will triple tailgun accuracy and save thousands of lives. He just hasn't built it yet. The disaster didn't start with a single mission. It started with math, cold, merciless math, that no commander in the 8th Air Force wanted to confront. In the fall of 1943, the strategic bombing doctrine was already bleeding out on the European front. The B-17 was advertised as a flying fortress, bristling with guns, armor, and confidence. Film reels back home showed smiling air crews posing in front of gleaming aluminum giants ready to punch the heart out of Hitler's war machine. But the men inside those airframes knew the truth. At altitude, where the air thinned and engines strained and the bitter cold chewed through bone, the fortress bled. It bled badly. Every mission briefing carried the same unspoken question. How many wouldn't come back today? Commanders tried to mask the dread with maps and red yarn lines, stretching toward industrial targets deep in Germany, but the numbers drowned the optimism. Crews were required to fly 25 missions before rotating home. Statistically and increasingly obviously, almost nobody survived 25. Tail gunners, the men tasked with defending the bomber's most vulnerable arc, weren't faring any better. Many of them didn't live long enough to learn what they were doing wrong. From the ground, the pattern seemed almost predictable. German fighters would form up behind a bomber stream like wolves tracking a herd. They'd stalk from 6 o'clock low, drifting upward into the blind cone, where the ring and bead sight became nearly useless. The moment they crossed into firing range, their 20mm cannons spat fire. Entire tail sections disintegrated in less than a second. More than one pilot reported watching the rear fuselage of a wingman simply vanish, sheared off so cleanly it looked as if it had been erased. Inside the cockpits of the Luftwaffe interceptors, the scene looked brutally simple. The American gunners were slow to track, slow to adjust, slow to correct. The iron sights were too primitive, too narrow in field of view, too clumsy at 300 miles per hour. A German pilot needed only 15 seconds of courage and a straight attack run. The bomber couldn't maneuver. The tail gunner couldn't compensate for closing speed. Gravity and geometry did the rest. From the perspective of a mechanic on the hardstand, the failure felt mechanical, not tactical. They saw returning aircraft limping in on shredded elevators, scorched turrets, ripped control lines. They wiped blood from floors and replaced armor plates pocked with holes the size of fists. Tail guns were intact. The tail gunners were not. Something was fundamentally wrong, and everyone knew it, even if no one could agree on the cause. The official reports described the same nightmare in clinical language. Hit rates insufficient. Engagement success below operational threshold. Defensive doctrine underperforming. Underperforming was a polite word for catastrophic. Engineers argued the solution was more hardware-powered turrets, improved mounts, upgraded reflectors, but every fix required time the 8th Air Force didn't have. Factories were overwhelmed. The logistics chain choked. Replacement parts arrived weeks too late in numbers far too small. Even if a new turret design existed on paper, it would never reach England fast enough to matter. Men were dying today, not one procurement cycle from now. Inside briefing rooms, the tension thickened. Commanders debated whether daylight bombing was even sustainable. They had built an entire strategy on the idea that precision attacks could break Germany's industrial backbone, but precision required survival. Surviving required defensive firepower that actually worked, and defensive firepower simply wasn't working. It wasn't just the tail. Waist gunners struggled with oxygen starvation. Top turrets jammed in cold. Ball turrets froze stiff if lubricated incorrectly. But the tail was the worst of all. Every German fighter pilot knew it. Every American gunner felt it. Some missions were so savage the silence afterward felt heavier than the noise during the fight. Crews walked back from their aircraft without speaking, covered in hydraulic mist and cordite residue, eyes hollow. The debriefing officers watched men struggle to describe what happened at their tail stations, hands shaking, voices flat, every sentence ending the same way. I couldn't keep up. I couldn't see him. I fired, but I think I was behind. The same quiet confession, again and again, like a mantra of failure. The system itself was failing, not the men who used it. Later intelligence officers studying captured Luftwaffe logs saw exactly how the Germans saw the problem. One pilot wrote, "Their tail guns are inaccurate, dangerous only when lucky." Another put it more bluntly, "American rear defense is weak, attack from 6 low." It was a tactical invitation, and the Luftwaffe accepted it with deadly precision. Every day ended the same. Too many empty bunks, too many letters written home, too many airframes towed away on shattered landing gear. Commanders tried to hide the casualty charts from younger crews. It didn't matter. Rumours spread faster than truth. By October, everyone at every airfield in England knew the reality. If the tail problem wasn't solved, the bomber war was lost. And the brutal irony, no general engineer or design bureau had any workable fix. The salvation of an entire bomber force would come not from a boardroom or a factory, but from a cramped tail gun position, and from a young man who refused to accept that good enough was good enough. He didn't look like the kind of man anyone would bet a war on. In truth, most men who first met Staff Sergeant Michael Romano barely remembered him at all. He blended into the background the way quiet people do, present, functional, polite, but invisible, the moment conversation shifted elsewhere. At Bassingbourn Airfield, where noise was a constant companion and personalities clashed like metal on metal, Romano moved through the chaos like a shadow. He wasn't tall enough to stand out in formation. He wasn't loud enough to dominate a briefing. He wasn't brilliant enough to impress instructors, nor reckless enough to worry commanders. He simply existed, one interchangeable tail gunner among hundreds. But the men who did notice him remembered little things they couldn't quite explain. The way he always tapped the edge of the gun mount before climbing inside, almost like greeting a stubborn old friend. The way he paused before every takeoff, not in fear but in calculation, eyes narrowing as if already imagining the angles he'd have to fight later. The way he listened more than he spoke, not shy, just observant. From a distance he had the look of a man who had learned to work hard long before he learned to dream. Romano had grown up in Pittsburgh steel mills, where heat, noise, and metal defined a childhood more than books ever did. His father's illness dragged him out of high school at 16. The mills raised him after that, shaping him, scarring him, toughening him in ways formal training never could. He learned to repair machinery by instinct, not diagrams. He learned to judge tension by feel, not talk numbers. He learned that metal speaks, if you listen closely enough, a certain rattle meaning misalignment, a certain vibration hinting at fatigue. None of this appeared anywhere in his Army Air Force's record. To the military, he was simply one more small-statured recruit whose size made him perfect for a tail position most men dreaded. They measured his height, his weight, his trigger discipline, his classroom scores. They never measured the instinct for troubleshooting that he carried like a sixth sense. They never saw how his eyes lingered on mechanisms as if listening for secrets hidden in steel. One of his crewmen years later would say, "You could hand Romano a broken toaster or a jammed 50 cal, and he'd poke it twice, mutter something, and suddenly it worked again, like he could smell what was wrong." But in 1943, nobody cared about that skill. They only cared whether you could shoot straight and keep your nerves steady at altitude. Romano's quietness often made others underestimate him. He didn't brag, didn't tell war stories, didn't try to win attention. During downtime, he sat with a cup of burned coffee, elbows on knees staring at his gloves or at the clouds drifting above the hangars. No one knew what he was thinking, and he didn't volunteer. Some assumed he was scared. Others assumed he was dim. A few thought he simply didn't care. But someone watching closely, someone paying attention, would have noticed the truth. Romano wasn't quiet because he was timid. He was quiet because he was studying. At the firing range, instructors shouted corrections, while most recruits fired blindly, trying to overpower their weapons through force and adrenaline. Romano fired slowly, methodically. He adjusted grip angle. He adjusted breathing. He tested where his wrist stiffened with the cold. He wasn't fast and he wasn't flashy, but even at 19 he carried himself like a man who fixed problems rather than complained about them. A waist gunner from another crew once watched Romano reload in the bitter Texas wind and said, half-joking, "Christ, man, you act like you're trying to fix the gun, not shoot it." Romano didn't look up. "Hard to shoot something that won't work," he said, tightening the latch. When he arrived in England, his new pilot, Lieutenant Holbrook, observed him with a similar curiosity. Romano rarely spoke during briefings, but he asked the kind of questions pilots don't expect from tail gunners. Questions about closure rates, evasive maneuvers, drift angles, slipstream distortion. Holbrook once asked him why he cared so much about the math behind the attack runs. Romano shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "If I understand how they think," he said, "maybe I can stop them." That was Romano's defining trait. He refused to accept. It can't be done. He had already buried that phrase years earlier in the red glow of Pittsburgh furnaces, where men who accepted broken systems simply got burned. Somewhere between patching worn-out conveyor lines and repairing warped molds, he had adopted a simple personal rule, one that would later save thousands of airmen. If something doesn't work, fix it. If you don't know how to fix it, learn. And if you can't learn fast enough, improvise until you can. But in the structured world of the Army Air Forces, this trait didn't look like genius. It looked like stubbornness. And stubborn men, quiet, overlooked, underestimated, were the ones history rarely noticed, until the moment everything depended on them. The idea didn't strike him like lightning. It crept in, quietly slow, persistent, unwelcome. The kind of realization a man doesn't want because once he sees it, he can't unsee it. And for Romano, it began on a night when exhaustion made the world soft around the edges. The mission had been brutal, another attack run over Frankfurt that left his bomber limping home stitched with holes from nose to tail. Romano had fired until his arms ached, until the smell of gunpowder clung to his mask, until he could no longer tell where the recoil ended and his own trembling began. 600 rounds and not a single strike, not one. When the engines finally shut down at Bassingbourn, he didn't follow the rest of the crew to debrief. Instead, he climbed down alone, boots crunching on the frosted tarmac, and stared at the tail section like it had betrayed him. The cold seeped through his gloves as he wrapped his fingers around the yoke. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. A strange, hollow clarity born from failure, repeated so many times it had become familiar. He had done everything the manuals taught him. He had aligned the ring and bead, estimated speed, guessed deflection, adjusted for drop, fired early, fired late, fired in desperation. None of it mattered. The system itself was flawed. He dropped into the tail position and sat there in the dark, the canopy glass around him still trembling from the aircraft's final roll. His breath fogged the plexiglass. His fingers traced the crude iron sight, 2 posts, a circle, a method unchanged since the days of biplanes and fabric wings. It felt ancient, wrong, almost insulting. The Germans had reflector sights that floated reticles in the air like ghosts. He had this. He leaned back, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. A faint smear of light from the hangar reflected in the curved plexiglass above him, a warped, distorted image of his own face staring back from somewhere behind him. Then he froze. The reflection wasn't straight ahead. It wasn't where his eyes naturally looked. It was off to the side, bent by the angle of the canopy. And in that warped image, he could see parts of the sky his iron sight could never cover. Not clearly, not sharply, but enough to break a rule in his mind he didn't know he'd been obeying. He leaned forward, testing angles. The mirrored distortion shifted, stretching shapes, bending light. A fighter crossing through that warped angle just for a second would appear before it entered his sight. His pulse ticked faster. What if that distortion could be controlled? What if it wasn't an accident? What if he could see his own tracers without moving his eyes from the target? The thought was ridiculous, absurd, mechanically improbable, possibly illegal. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Romano pulled out his logbook. His pencil hovered for a moment before he started sketching. Rough shapes at first. Arrows. Lines showing angles. The more he drew, the more he realized he wasn't designing a weapon. He was designing a way to see. The mirror wasn't enough by itself. He'd need something to anchor his aim, something to overlay a stable aiming reference, while the peripheral mirrors showed tracer correction. A proper reflector sight was impossible. The tail wasn't designed for one. But maybe with salvaged parts, maybe a piece of reflector glass could be mounted on the yoke. If he angled mirrors around it, small, convex, lightweight, he could create a hybrid system, a Frankenstein of optics, part stolen, part improvised, entirely unapproved. He stopped drawing and listened to the silent tail. The wind outside pushed softly against the fuselage, making the metal pop like cooling armor. Somewhere far off, a truck passed the hangar. Romano imagined the expression on an engineer's face if they saw what he was thinking. They'd laugh, they'd lecture, they'd bring up structural stress, sight calibration, acceptable tolerances. They'd say things like, "This is not in the manual, and improvised equipment compromises safety." But he wasn't thinking about regulations. He was thinking about his best friend dead 2 missions ago because Romano couldn't put a single round where it needed to go. He closed the logbook slowly. He knew what he needed. He also knew he couldn't get it alone. The maintenance shop smelled of oil, metal, and quiet resentment. Men worked there who had kept more bombers flying than the factory ever intended. Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman was one of them, a man built like a steel beam with hands that looked like they could bend aluminum by willpower alone. Romano found him hunched over a torn hydraulic line cigarette dangling from his lip. Kellerman glanced up. "You look like you're about to confess to a crime," he grunted. Romano held out the sketches. Kellerman stared at the drawings for a long moment, then another. His eyes narrowed, tracing angles, reflective surfaces, reticle placement, improvised brackets. He didn't speak. Romano waited, heart pounding. Finally, Kellerman exhaled smoke through his nose. "This is illegal," he said flatly. Romano nodded once. "You're asking me to modify defensive armament without engineering approval. Violates at least 6 technical orders." Another nod. Kellerman tapped the sketches against the workbench, thinking, "You fly tomorrow." "Yes." "Münster." Kellerman crushed his cigarette under his boot. "Then we'd better work fast." They didn't shake hands. They didn't smile. They just turned and moved silently with the urgency of men who understood the stakes. In the corner of the hangar, beneath a single flickering lamp, they began gathering scrap curved mirrors from broken navigation kits, plexiglass from shattered canopies, aluminum brackets from written-off airframes, and if they were lucky, a reflector sight salvaged from a wrecked P-47. Every piece of forbidden metal they touched whispered the same truth. They weren't supposed to do this. They absolutely should not do this, and they were going to do it anyway, because sometimes survival doesn't wait for permission. The modification lasted exactly 20 minutes before the war tried to crush it. Romano had barely stepped off the crew truck when he saw the look on Master Sergeant Donald Pierce's face, an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. Pierce wasn't a man who shocked easily. He'd spent 2 years patching busted aircraft, towing fuselages that still dripped hydraulic fluid, and pulling bodies out of gun positions so mangled he had to identify them by boots. But the sight waiting in the tail of Knockout Dropper that afternoon, the mirrors, the reticle, the welded bracket, made the veins rise in his neck. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence was louder. He simply turned and walked briskly toward the squadron armament officer's office, like a man escorting a detonator he desperately wants to get rid of. Romano followed at a distance, gut tightening. He knew this moment was coming. He just didn't expect it to come so fast. Captain Richard Voss arrived with a clipboard tucked under one arm and authority radiating from every inch of his pressed uniform. He strode to the tail section, stopped and stared at the modification, with a level of disgust usually reserved for finding a rat in a mess hall. Sergeant Romano Voss said, without looking at him, tone sharp enough to cut aluminum, "Would you care to explain the unauthorized equipment installed in your gun position?" Romano stood at attention, frost still clinging to his flight jacket. "Sir, I installed an improved sighting system." "You installed what?" Voss stepped forward, voice rising. "Do you have any comprehension of the regulations you violated? Technical Order 0120EG2 explicitly prohibits unauthorized modifications to defensive armament." Romano's jaw tightened. "Sir, the system works. I shot down." "I don't care if you shot down the entire Luftwaffe, Sergeant." Voss jabbed a finger toward the welded bracket. "This is not a backyard hot rod. This is a combat aircraft. Unapproved modifications compromise structural integrity, create fire hazards, and interfere with system reliability. Remove it immediately, or I will have you court-martialed for destruction of government property." The words hit harder than enemy fire. Romano felt the same cold heaviness in his chest he felt whenever tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. A sensation that whispered, "You're outnumbered, outmatched, out of time." But then, unexpectedly, someone stepped forward. Captain Lieutenant Holbrook said quietly, "My tail gunner got his first kill today because of that sight. Maybe we should." "Your opinion is noted," Lieutenant Voss snapped, and dismissed. Holbrook's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. In a rigid hierarchy, defiance had limits, but the seed had been planted. Someone besides Romano had finally seen what the mirror system could do. Word spread across the base by the time the crews reached evening mess. Rumors traveled faster than truth and mutated along the way. Some swore Romano had created a three-angle ghost sight. Others claimed he'd stolen classified equipment. A few whispered he had accidentally discovered a weakness in German attack patterns. But one thing remained constant. Everyone knew Romano had broken the rules, and everyone wanted to know if it was worth it. Veteran gunners crowded around his table, peppering him with questions. How wide's the field of view? Can it handle turbulence? Can Kellerman build more? Did it really show your tracers? But as excitement bubbled among enlisted men, panic simmered among officers. The idea that a single sergeant's improvised mod, built from scrap no less, could outperform existing doctrine threatened everything: tradition, hierarchy, engineering, authority, and the chain of command. If enlisted men could modify aircraft at will, where did it end? So the pushback came fast. The next morning, Captain Theodore Morrison, Assistant Armament Officer, convened an emergency meeting. 14 officers crammed into a briefing room, too small for the tension inside it. The radiator clicked. Papers shuffled. Rank and ego sat side by side. "Gentleman," Morrison began, "we have a discipline problem." He held up Romano's sketches like evidence at a trial. "A sergeant has installed unapproved components of unknown provenance, using tools and materials not certified for weapons modifications. This sets a dangerous precedent." A murmur rolled through the room. "With respect, Sir Major William Calhoun interrupted. Romano shot down a fighter yesterday using this system." "One engagement," Morrison snapped. "A single success doesn't justify saving a bomber," Calhoun shot back. "Doesn't justify giving our gunners a fighting chance." The room erupted, voices overlapping, hands chopping the air, officers leaning forward with clenched jaws. "This is unsafe. This is reckless. This could save lives. This violates protocol. We are hemorrhaging planes. You want to turn the group into a workshop free for all." It stopped being a discussion and became a storm. Engineers lectured about load stress. Operations officers countered with casualty numbers. Logistics complained about parts shortages. Tacticians argued the hit rate needed improvement yesterday, not 6 months from now. No one mentioned Romano. They argued about him like he wasn't even alive. Finally, the matter was pushed to a higher authority. Colonel Stanley Ray, commander of the 91st Bomb Group, a man who carried the memory of World War I dogfights in the lines on his face, listened in silence for 90 minutes as the officers tore into each other. When they finally exhausted their arguments, Ray looked at Morrison and asked calmly, "How many bombers did we lose last week?" 17, sir. "And how many fighters did our tail gunners shoot down?" 3, sir. Ray nodded slowly. The room felt suddenly smaller. "Captain Ray," said voice, "deliberate, your concerns about regulations are valid. But I'm more concerned about losing 17 goddamn airplanes every week because our defensive armament doesn't work." He turned to Romano, who stood near the wall shoulders, squared eyes forward. "Sergeant, your modification stays. You'll fly the next 3 missions with gun cameras recording every shot. If your hit rate improves measurably, we authorize group-wide installation. If not, we remove the equipment and you face disciplinary action." "Understood." Romano swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "Good." Ray stood. "This meeting is adjourned. And someone get me a set of those mirror drawings." The room emptied in silence, except for one undeniable truth. Romano hadn't just broken a rule. He'd broken open a system, and systems never break quietly. The first test wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It wasn't supposed to be anything at all, just a quiet trial on a field, far from enemy fire, far from the chaos of a mission. But war has a way of twisting even small moments into something jagged, and for Romano, the night before the test felt heavier than any mission he had flown. The mirror system sat on a folding table inside the hangar, dimly lit by a single work lamp. The reflector glass gleamed in shards of gold, the curved mirrors catching stray beams like fragments of broken stars. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a gamble. Holbrook hovered nearby, watching Romano adjust the last bolt. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Romano nodded, though certainty was the last thing he felt. His fingers moved with practiced calm, but his stomach churned. He had risked rank reputation and possibly his freedom for this device. If it failed, no one would remember his effort, only the rule he broke. Kellerman walked over, wiping grease off his hands. "I reinforced the brackets," he muttered. "Should hold. Mostly." "Mostly," Holbrook echoed. Kellerman shrugged. "It's war, Lieutenant. Mostly is the best we ever get." They worked until the hangar lights flickered off, signaling curfew. Romano lingered a moment longer, staring at the improvised assembly. It no longer felt like a machine. It felt like a verdict waiting to happen. The morning air was sharp enough to sting his lungs. A layer of frost coated the wings of Knockout Dropper as ground crew prepared the aircraft for a controlled gunnery test above the North Sea. Not a combat mission, just a run to evaluate the new sight system with gun cameras rolling. Romano climbed into the tail position, heart pounding in a tight rhythm. Every metallic click as he buckled in felt amplified. The cabin lights dimmed. Engines roared to life. The entire fuselage trembled. He reached for the spade grips. The metal was freezing. He felt like he was gripping the handle of a guillotine. The bomber lifted off the runway, climbing into a pale morning sky. Clouds drifted below like torn cotton. The intercom crackled. "Romano, you good back there?" Holbrook's voice. "Good enough," Romano answered, though sweat was already building beneath his collar. At 120,000 feet, they began the test run. A tow target trailed behind another bomber flying ahead, a canvas sleeve meant to simulate an enemy fighter. Nothing dangerous, nothing unpredictable, just a practice target. Holbrook banked slightly. "All right, let's see what she can do." Romano pressed his cheek against the cold rubber of his oxygen mask and centered the target through the reflector sight. He pulled the trigger. The tracers streamed out bright streaks of orange, cutting across the sky, and missed wide. Not slightly, not barely, by several feet. He adjusted, fired again. Again the tracers drifted off course, curving wrong, refusing to align with the reticle or the mirrored feedback. "What the hell?" he muttered. He checked the mirror angles, checked the reflector plate, checked the yoke mount. Again he fired. Again the tracers went wild. Holbrook's voice came through tense. "Romano, what's happening back there?" Romano didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt heat rising in his face, not from temperature but humiliation. The system looked ridiculous now, childish, amateur, the kind of mistake that ends careers. Returning to base, Holbrook announced. Romano's hands trembled as the bomber descended. His breath fogged the glass in uneven bursts. It felt like the cabin was shrinking, like the aluminum walls were pushing in. Failure clung to him like smoke. Back on the ground, he climbed out silently. Nobody spoke. Nobody had to. The disappointment was a living thing. Kellerman approached slowly, eyes scanning the system. Maybe a bracket slipped, he offered weakly. No, Romano said flatly. Maybe the turbulence. No. Kellerman frowned. Then, what? Romano didn't answer. He just stared at the sight, jaw locked, fighting an anger he didn't trust himself to release. The officers who opposed him were right there in his mind, both real and imagined, telling him he was reckless, foolish, dangerous. One test and the entire idea looked like a delusion. He walked away before anyone could stop him. Night fell cold and unforgiving. The base quieted except for the distant thrum of engines and the occasional clatter of tools echoing across the airfield. Romano found himself wandering back to the tail section, flashlight in hand, like a man returning to the scene of a crime. He climbed into the cramped compartment, the metal cold enough to numb his palms. The mirror system still sat mounted in place, silent and accusing. He pointed the flashlight at the reticle, then at the mirrors, then at the gun barrels. Something felt wrong. Not mechanically, conceptually. He closed his eyes and pictured the test run, the tracer lines, the angles, the corrections he tried to make, and suddenly the memory sharpened like a blade. The bomber had been flying level during the test, but the tow target had been drifting upward, much like a real fighter entering a climb attack. Romano's sight system was designed around a level reference plane, not an angled one. Of course, the tracers drifted. The mirrors showed alignment, but not relative movement. His heart kicked. He grabbed his logbook, flipping pages frantically. Angles, curvature, optical distortion, reticle offset. There, an equation he had scribbled and dismissed earlier because he didn't have time to test it. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He hadn't built the system wrong. He had built it incomplete. It needed a dynamic angle correction for climbing targets. A small adjustment to mirror pitch. Maybe quarter inch, maybe less. Just enough to bring tracer feedback into real-time alignment. He felt the spark, that rare electric jolt that comes when frustration cracks and understanding pours through the gap. He worked until his knuckles were raw and his breath turned to fog around him. Wrenches clinked softly, screws tightened, mirror mounts shifted. Tiny adjustments, each one delicate, each one essential. Sweat dripped despite the cold. By dawn, the system wasn't just repaired. It was transformed. The second test began with no fanfare. Just a cold sky, a buzzing intercom, and Romano whispering to himself, "Don't screw this up." Holbrook's voice came through. "Tau, target, in position. Whenever you're ready." Romano exhaled slowly and centered the sight. The target slid across the reticle. His peripheral vision caught the mirrored alignment, now sharper, cleaner, more responsive. He squeezed the trigger. The tracers streamed out, and for the first time, they curved exactly where he expected them to go. He adjusted half an inch. The mirrored feedback corrected instantly. He fired again. Hit. Not close. Not almost. Hit. He fired a third burst, short, controlled, instinctive. 3 sets of tracers converged on the canvas sleeve. The tow target shredded in a cloud of fabric. Holbrook's laughter burst through the intercom. "Holy hell, Mikey, that's dead on." Romano didn't laugh. He just closed his eyes, letting the relief wash over him in trembling waves. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. The feeling of a man who had been drowning for weeks and finally found air. The bomber leveled out. The test continued. Every adjustment Romano made, the system responded like an extension of his own instincts. Tracers hit. Corrections synced. The mirrors no longer felt like scrap, they felt like clarity made visible. When they landed, officers were already waiting. Morrison, Calhoun, Pierce, even Colonel Ray. They watched the gun camera footage in silence, hit after hit after hit, consistent, predictable, devastating. Ray turned slowly toward Romano. "What do you call this thing, Sergeant?" he asked. Romano swallowed. "Just a sight, sir." Ray smiled in a way that carried the weight of 100 lost bombers. "No, son. This is a miracle made of metal, and for the first time since the war began, the tail gunner felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope, real, impossible, forbidden hope, and the sense that the sky was about to change. The change didn't come all at once. It came quietly at first, like the subtle shift in wind before a storm breaks. Only the gunners noticed it in those early days, the way their tracers suddenly behaved the way they always wished they would. The way enemy fighters reacted differently, no longer charging in with the casual confidence of men expecting an easy kill. Something in the air felt altered, uncertain, unsettled. By the time the 91st Bomb Group flew their next mission, 18 aircraft carried Romano's improvised sight system. Kellerman's shop had turned into a crude assembly line of scavenged parts, half-legal tools, and men working through the night. They weren't just fabricating equipment, they were fabricating hope piece by salvaged piece. On October 20th, the group crossed the Dutch coast, heading toward Düren. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in a boiling swarm of engine noise and gunfire. This time the German pilots approached with the same familiar tactic: 6 o'clock, low, confident, disciplined, predictable. A Bf-109 slid neatly into position behind one of the modified B-17 seconds, its pilot already calculating the firing window. He banked upward cannons, spitting flame, and then he jerked violently as a burst of 50 cal rounds tore through his left-wing root. The fighter spun out, trailing smoke. On another bomber, a FW-190 closed for the kill, expecting the usual panicked, inaccurate fire. Instead, the tail gunner corrected in real time, walking his shots across the sky with a precision that shouldn't have been possible from a moving, shuddering platform. The fighter peeled away, trailing pieces of its own fuselage like burning confetti. One by one, the familiar attack patterns fell apart. By the end of the mission, tail gunners equipped with the mirror reflector hybrid scored 11 confirmed kills against 47 attacks, a hit rate of 23.4%, nearly triple anything previously recorded. In the debriefing rooms, officers who once dismissed the modification stared at the footage in stunned silence. The gun cameras told a story no briefing or lecture could capture. They showed tracers sliding into perfect convergence. They showed German fighters abruptly breaking away, shocked by the accuracy. They showed B-17 seconds that should have exploded in fire returning home with their tails intact. Morrison, who once argued that the system was unsafe, watched the film 3 times before finally exhaling. "All right," he muttered. "It works." His voice carried no resentment now, only the exhausted relief of a man who no longer needed to bury more airmen. Colonel Ray wasted no time. "How many of these can we equip?" he demanded. "As many as we can build," Kellerman replied. "If we cannibalize wrecked fighters, raid the supply depots, and work in shifts, we can do 4 a day." "Then start," Ray ordered. 2 weeks. Every tail gun in the group. Authorization from higher headquarters was not requested. Not immediately, anyway. Across the English countryside, other groups began hearing rumors, whispered stories of a ghost site that let gunners hit targets the way turret gunners did. Reports trickled up the chain, confirmation like sparks hitting dry tinder. Brigadier General Frederick Castle visited Bassingbourn personally. He crawled into the tail compartment of Knockout Dropper, inspected every bracket, every screw, every mirror. He studied the footage. He questioned Romano for half an hour. "What made you think this would work?" Castle asked. Romano shrugged, uncomfortable under the attention. "The old sights didn't work, sir. So I figured anything else was worth a shot." Castle laughed, the kind of laugh no one in the 8th Air Force had heard from a general in months. "Fair enough," he said. "This goes fleet-wide." By November, the modification spread across multiple bomb groups. The hit rates followed, climbing into the low 20s again and again. The effect rippled outward into the war itself. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to exploiting the B-17's blind spots, suddenly faced return fire that felt shockingly deliberate. After action, German reports began noting an unexpected rise in tail accuracy. Some called it improved training. Others suspected a new American fire control system, impossible to verify, but undeniable in its consequences. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, a respected night fighter ace temporarily assigned to day operations, wrote in his diary, "The flying fortresses are more dangerous now. Tail gunners correct their fire as if guided. Attacks from 6 o'clock carry unacceptable risk." Unacceptable risk. That phrase alone signaled a tectonic shift in the air war. The Luftwaffe began altering tactics. Rear attacks, once the bread and butter of interception, were gradually abandoned. German fighters tested higher angles, steeper dives, even head-on attacks. Some tactics worked, many didn't, but every change cost them dearly in time, training, and casualties. A system designed in a cramped tail compartment by a two-year-old factory worker had forced the enemy to rewrite their playbook. The strategic effect was measured not just in kills, but in survivability. Across thousands of sorties, bomb groups equipped with improved tail sighting, Romano's system, and the refined versions that followed, suffered 32 to 37% fewer losses from rear attacks. A difference so large it shifted the statistical odds of survival, pushing dozens of crews past the once impossible threshold of 25 missions. For the first time in months, the men of the 8th Air Force felt like the tide had turned. They weren't flying to their deaths anymore. They had a chance, thin, fragile but real. Word spread across bases, across air crews, across briefing rooms, filled with the smell of coffee and fear. Men who once braced for inevitable doom now leaned forward in hope. Gunners requested the new system by name. Mechanics competed to see who could assemble them fastest. And Romano, despite the attention, insisted he was nobody special. But the war remembered him, even if he didn't want it to. And as winter approached, and the skies over Europe filled once more with burning contrails and thunderous engines, one truth became impossible to ignore. A handful of mirrors and a salvaged reflector sight had just saved more bombers than any doctrine manual or engineering board ever had. The war did not end with a burst of triumph for Michael Romano. There was no parade, no champagne, no photographers waiting beside the runway to immortalize the moment. Wars rarely reward the men who quietly save lives. They simply let them go home if they're lucky. Romano's luck ran thin before victory finally arrived. On February 22nd, 1944 Big Week, the massive Allied effort to cripple German aircraft production, his bomber took a direct burst of flak near Leipzig. The explosion ripped through the fuselage like a giant hand-tearing paper. Fuel sprayed across the tail compartment. Hydraulic fluid dripped in freezing ribbons. Metal screamed. Romano kept firing. His mirrors shook. His oxygen mask rattled. The reticle flickered as vibrations hammered through the mounting bracket. He saw the Bf-109 sliding into attack position too close, its pilot already lining up the kill shot on a bomber that was bleeding altitude. Romano corrected instinctively, the mirrors flashing tracer feedback in the corner of his vision. He fired a short, violent burst. The fighter blew apart in mid-air, shattered by the accuracy of a system that had no right to exist and that the Army Air Forces had initially tried to remove. But victory offered no comfort. His bomber was dying beneath him. Holbrook's voice cracked through the intercom, strained with pain. "We're losing hydraulics. Prepare to ditch." Romano braced himself in the tail as the B-17 fell through thick grey clouds, shuddering violently. He could hear men shouting in the forward section, could smell burning insulation, could feel cold wind forcing its way through torn metal seams. When the bomber finally hit the ground, hard, raw, violent, it skidded through a Belgian field in a spray of mud and fire. Miraculously, the crew survived, every one of them. They crawled from the wreckage, dazed, burned, bruised, but alive. Romano's hands shook as he pulled himself clear, his boots sinking into the wet earth. Behind him the tail he had spent months fighting with lay twisted like the broken wing of a bird. They were captured within hours. Romano spent the last months of the war in a German POW camp, cold, starving, working to survive each day with the same stubborn instinct that had once pushed him to redesign the tail defenses of a bomber. When liberation finally came, he weighed 127 pounds. His uniform hung off him like an old coat stolen from someone bigger. Back in the United States, after medical treatment and debriefings, the Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation praised his extraordinary achievement in aerial combat and innovative contribution to defensive armament effectiveness. It did not mention that his innovation violated regulations. It did not mention the mirrors. It did not mention the argument that nearly ended his career. Romano didn't mind. He had no interest in medals or headlines. He returned to Pittsburgh, where steel mills and river fog and familiar streets welcomed him home with more warmth than any ceremony could. He married his high school sweetheart, settled into a machinist's job, and worked for 37 years without ever seeking attention or recognition. His children grew up knowing he had flown in World War II, nothing more. He didn't talk about the missions. He didn't talk about the modification. He didn't talk about the lives he saved. Sometimes at night he would sit alone in the living room, polishing an old metal tool until it gleamed. His wife once asked why he cared so much for objects, even broken ones. He just smiled gently and said, "Everything works if you understand how it's supposed to." He never explained what he meant. Decades passed. The war faded into documentaries, reunions, black and white photos tucked into albums. But among the men of the 91st Bomb Group, the ones who lived long enough to see the world change, Romano's name carried a weight that time could not erode. In 1983, at a reunion at the old Bassingbourn airfield, the past found him again. He walked slowly across the restored tarmac, grey-haired now, shoulders a little stooped, eyes soft with age. A group of former tail gunners approached him, men who had flown with his mirror system, men who had returned home because their guns finally shot where they aimed. One of them, Gerald Hammond, reached into a small cloth bag and pulled out a piece of curved aluminum, a mirror bracket, dent-scarred, burnished by age. He placed it in Romano's hands. "My kids exist because of this," Hammond said quietly, "because you refused to accept lousy sights, because you didn't wait for permission. You saved us." Romano looked down at the bracket, tracing it with a thumb. The old metal reflected a distorted version of his face, just as the plexiglass had decades earlier. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion in the air. "You would have done the same," he said softly. But Hammond shook his head. "No, we didn't. You did." Romano didn't argue. He rarely did. History would not carve his name into textbooks. His obituary in 2003 mentioned only a single line, World War II veteran 8th Air Force. It didn't mention that he changed the war. It didn't mention that he saved thousands. It didn't mention that courage sometimes comes in the form of a man with a wrench, a pencil, and a refusal to accept failure. But the men who survived because of him never forgot. Some impacts shake the world loudly. Romano's echoed quietly through lives saved, families born, and futures made possible by a handful of mirrors, and a young gunner who simply refused to stop trying. History rarely remembers the small hinges that swing wide the doors of consequence. It celebrates the generals, the strategies, the sweeping offensives, but not the moments when an ordinary man makes a choice that redirects the arc of lives he will never meet. Michael Romano never asked to change the war. He didn't wake up wanting to innovate or to challenge regulations or to shift the balance of aerial combat. He just wanted to survive long enough to go home, and for the men flying beside him to have the same chance. And maybe that's the truth we overlook when we study history at a distance. The world doesn't turn because of grand plans. It turns because of ordinary people who refuse to accept that a broken system must stay broken. Romano's improvised mirror system didn't come from a laboratory, a government contract, or an engineering board. It came from frustration, grief, instinct, and a sense of responsibility too heavy for a two-year-old to carry, but impossible for him to ignore. In a moment when nobody was coming to save him, he saved himself, and in doing so saved thousands more. Today, generations who have never flown in a bomber or felt the cold bite of 25000 feet still live with the echoes of his choice. The principles he discovered, improvised optics, peripheral alignment, real-time correction, are built into modern aircraft, drones, and defensive systems worldwide. His idea lives in machines that travel faster, farther, and more precisely than anything he could have imagined. And yet the core of his innovation wasn't mechanical. It was human. It was the belief that knowledge is not something reserved for experts or granted by authority. It can grow from the hands of a machinist, the eyes of a young gunner, the instincts forged in a steel mill long before anyone called him sergeant. Romano proved something timeless. You don't need permission to notice the truth. And sometimes noticing the truth means breaking the rules that keep people dying. In a world that moves faster than ever, where bureaucracy often strains innovation, and where problems feel too large for any one person, Romano's legacy whispers a different message. Look closer, question the obvious, fix the thing you're told cannot be fixed. And when the moment comes, when the lives of others hinge on your courage, choose the harder path, the one that asks more of you, the one that frightens you, because you know it's right. Thousands of airmen survived their missions because a young man refused to let failure become routine. Entire families exist because someone they never met once spent 3 hours in a cold tail compartment, sketching mirrors in the dark. History may not carve his story into its marble walls, but it lives in the quiet places, in the generations that followed, in the technologies built atop his insight, in the truth that even a single voice can disrupt a failing system. Romano's life reminds us that innovation doesn't always look like genius. Sometimes it looks like stubbornness, sometimes like desperation, sometimes like a man hunched over a notebook, refusing to accept that good enough is good enough. And maybe, if we're lucky, it looks like us.